blood is a biological medium that's based in water. We're taught, I don't know which grade, let's say fifth, that matter exists in three phases: solid, liquid, gas. So copper, molten copper, gaseous copper. Water, ice, water, steam. So I used to be an ER doctor, and I used to see people cut open and shot. And we know that the cells are 70% water. So I used to ask, what phase is it in? Well, it's not ice, it's not steam, so it must be water. A cell is membrane-bound bag of water with stuff in it. So the people were shot, and so you would expect to see a geyser of water squirting out of their leg and a puddle on the floor, right? Because that's 70% of them is water, and they just got ripped open. And you know how many times as an ER doctor I saw water dripping out of a person's leg? Or
Zero.
So where's the water? It's the same answer as if you look at Jell-O, right? Everybody knows Jell-O. Which phase is that in? It's not ice, it's not water, because you can poke it and nothing comes out. It's definitely not steam. The problem is there are 4 phases of water, not 3. No matter what anybody says, it's an observable, easy to prove fact, and only water. That's the only one we know that has 4 phases.
Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at BlueBlocks.com, the leaders in scientifically proven blue light blocking glasses like the ones that I'm wearing now and the ones that I always wear when I'm on tech, especially in the late afternoon, early evening hours, because melatonin production, growth hormone release, immune response, recovery from exercise can be diminished if you're getting artificial LED exposure from blue light sources such as computers, iPads, Kindle e-readers, cell phones, and so forth. So protect your eyes just like you protect yourself by wearing a seatbelt when you drive. Also, what's new from our sponsor, BlueBlocks.com, is this new Remedy sleep mask. Now, if you're like me, you travel, if you're in different sleep environments, or if you have light coming into your bedroom from your roommates or your neighbors or, street lights, you definitely need to protect your exposure to light at night, because that small amount of light can negatively affect melatonin release, can affect growth hormone and all that. So they have this new mask. I wear it every night now. It's amazing. Definitely check it out. Go to blueblocks.com and use the promo code HIH to save 15% off your next order. So let's cut back to it with Dr. Thomas Cowan. Please listen to this one with an open mind. It's a mind bender. Dr. Cowan, as you probably could tell from that introduction, is very smart. And he's going to make a compelling case that the heart is actually slowing down blood flow. It's not a pump. It's almost like a brake. And the way that the blood is flowing is through this 4th phase of water that he talked about in the introduction. So it's an awesome discussion. It really changed how much emphasis and time I allocate to things like grounding, to getting sun exposure, and all that, and mitigating my exposure to electromagnetic frequencies and non-native EMF. So hope you enjoy the show. Let's cut right back to it. I noticed you have different mineral water in the office.
Oh, it's nothing. It's whatever.
Yeah.
I don't tend to drink it anyway.
Because of the new reports on microplastics and things like that, or?
I have a water filter system in my house, and then I put it through a structuring thing. I don't know much about that water.
Yeah. Maybe we can talk about the, what you talk about in the book, The Cosmic Heart, a lot about the structure of water and kind of Gerald Pollack's the 4th kind of phase and so forth. Which water structuring device do you personally use?
Well, first of all, I would say that as far as I know, there isn't a perfect water structuring device. The best water structuring device is living somewhere where there's glacial runoff and the water is going over rocks and rivers and all, and that unfortunately is far different than what most of us have. And should I be looking more there?
No, yeah, we're good. Yeah, good question though.
So as far as I can see, every possible choice is a compromise and not a great one. I don't like getting water from Italy or France, or not that I have anything in particular against Italians or French people. There's a place in Arkansas, I think, that has good water, but even that is not perfect. I use this 14-stage filter, which what I call getting the stuff out. Mm-hmm. So water has stuff in it that you don't want to be in there, including birth control pills, including antibiotics, including hormones, including Viagra, including all kinds of stuff that has been found in water. Microplastics, like you say, are probably in most of them. So hopefully the filtering gets that out, and then you're left with unstructured, mostly demineralized water. So then you have to run it over some sort of mineralization thing, and then you have to put it in some sort of a vortex to get it to be structured again. And we can talk about later, if you want, what at least I mean by structuring.
Yeah, I think it's important, and it's another narrative that's not being talked about. I think people realize now they need to filter out all the crap, like you mentioned, but not restructure the water and then re-add in minerals. There's this device that I found from, I think it's Toronto, called Santa V, I believe. It's a little metal tube with minerals. I've been adding that in, but the structure is kind of something that's new. You talk about in the book about how kind of this, the phasic, could be getting the terminology a little bit wrong, but in diffusion and the capillaries, because there's very little velocity, it's the structure of the water on the membranes that allows kind of absorption of nutrition and diffusion of toxins. Is that?
I mean, I think that's a little bit out of context, if I may be permitted to say so.
Yeah, totally.
And if we're going to talk about that, I think that the context has to do with the larger aspect of what makes the blood move in the first place. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you want to get into that, but I can start going with that if you want.
Let's do that. I mean, is the basic premise that the heart is more, it suctions, it's not so much a pump, which is contrary to what a lot of people kind of think or assume.
Right. So let me take this back even a step further. I know it's again, it's a conversational versus letting me have a chance, to sort of put this in context. And
yeah, that's great.
I mean, that's the way I guess I'm used to it. So I wrote this book, Human Heart, Cosmic Heart, for basically two reasons. And then there's a bunch of other stuff that has to do with the book. Mm-hmm. The first reason was everybody and their brother, every cardiologist, every internist, every man on the street, every person you meet, if you say, why does the blood move? So we all know the blood moves in the body. Why does the blood move? They say it's pumped by the heart. Now, what they mean by that is the muscular walls of the heart generate pressure, which propels the blood around the body. So essentially, it's a pressure propulsion device that is because of the contraction of the muscular walls of the heart. So that's what we're taught in 5th grade, 8th grade, 12th grade, I don't know which grade. And that's what the whole edifice of cardiology is based on. Now, if you ask another question, maybe I should let you ask the questions, but so where did this start? Like, who decided this? Was it like Moses that came from the 10 Commandments? The 11th commandment was that the heart pumps the blood. It turns out it came from Descartes, a famous guy. Everybody knows Descartes. I think, therefore I am. He was convinced that there is no principles in nature besides mechanical principles. There is no such thing as life. There's no life forces. There's no vital forces. There's just mechanics. Therefore, the only way that the blood could possibly move is if it's mechanically pushed by the heart. Now, a lot of people say that the first person who said that the heart is a pump was a guy named William Harvey, who's still considered the father of cardiology. He was the one who said that the circulation is a circuit, goes arteries, capillaries, veins, heart, and around like that. But he actually, in fact, I would say I would erred in my book to finger him as the one who started this. And he didn't really. He said the circulation is a circuit, but the blood is moved by a vital force in the blood. So that's where it started, and everybody has believed it since. The first person that I know of who started not believing that was Rudolph Steiner, who said, one of the most important things that humans need to understand for our evolution is that the heart does not pump the blood. So who was Rudolph Steiner? He was the founder of biodynamics, the most important organic agricultural system in the world, the founder of the Waldorf schools, which is the second largest school movement in the world. He founded anthroposophical medicine, of which there's public hospitals in Europe where all the doctors have to be trained in this holistic form of medicine. So he was not somebody who one should take lightly. Doesn't mean he's always right, but he said the heart is not a pump and you guys better figure this out.
And when was that, for context?
1920-ish. I don't know the exact day that he first said that, but it was around then. He died in 25, and he spent the last... He wasn't a medical doctor, he was a philosopher and kind of mystic, if you want to use that word. Founder of the Anthroposophical Society, and he was the head of the Theosophical Society for a while.
And what does that mean, anthroposophical?
Anthroposophy just means the wisdom of man.
I see.
So it was a way of seeing the world that he talked about. So, and he was a Goethe scholar. Basically, that was his profession, if you want to say that. So he says that. People sort of, well, I don't know what to do with this, but anyways. And then more recently, people in the anthroposophical movement, of which I have a connection with, have taken that up and tried to figure out what it means. Interestingly, recently, there's two people right now, at least in the US, who are really talking about this. There's me, and there's a guy named Branko Furst, who's an anesthesiologist. And he wrote a very technical, in-depth version of this story, and saying that heart can't possibly be the pressure propulsion device, and the blood moves of its own accord. He doesn't exactly know why it moves, but it must move of its own accord. And his book was endorsed by the head of cardiac anesthesiology at Harvard Medical School, who said, Branko's right, and this is the reason we can't treat congestive heart failure better now than 50 years ago, because we have a incomplete, erroneous view of why the blood moves. So when the blood stops moving the way it should, we don't know why. So I only say that to point out that apparently I'm not the only one. So the argument against the heart being a pump, if I can do that, are basically a few very simple things. If you look at the heart the circulation as a circuit, you have this 1 pound, fairly thin-walled organ. And when I say thin-walled, I've been criticized for that, because the heart is a thick wall compared to most other organs. But it's only about this thick. We're not talking about this thick. We're talking about a pretty thin, and it has a sort of spiral shape. So some points it's actually very thin, including the apex where it's one layer thick. So that's a pretty thin wall for what we're talking about. So it emerges, the blood emerges out of the left ventricle, goes through the arteries, and then comes to the capillaries, where it exchanges blood and gases, and then it goes back through the veins back to the heart. Now, the first thing to say about this is if you do a flow diagram, and you say, well, how fast is the blood moving at these different places? It turns out the blood is moving the fastest as it enters the heart from the veins, and as it exits the heart through the aorta. And it's the same speed as it enters and exits the heart. And then it goes slower and slower as it goes through the artery until it gets to the capillaries, where it basically stops. It does a little back and forth shimmy, and then it starts going again. Now, if you think about that, fast it exits the heart, slower to the capillaries. It has to stop at the capillaries to exchange gases and blood, and then it has to get going again. So when I tell people that, I say, if you think about that like a bus goes fast from Los Angeles to St. Louis, and then it stops, and people get on and off, and then it starts going again to go to New York. There must be an engine in the bus in St. Louis to get it going, or it's not going to go from St. Louis to New York. In other words, if the blood has stopped, that's where you need the pump.
Right.
And if the blood is going the same velocity as it enters the heart and as it exits the heart, what do you need a pump for? Like, no farmer would put a pump to make water not go any faster or harder, whatever harder would mean. And if the water stopped at the bottom of the hill, they'd put a pump there to get it come back up.
Right.
Why would you need a pump at the top of the hill? So that's the first thing. The other thing is this circulation, if you put the blood vessels end to end, they would encircle the earth 3 times. There's a lot of capillaries in us. So let's say, well, maybe not 3 times, let's say 1 time. If you're going to push blood, which is very sticky fluid, with stuff floating in it, right? Red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets. The stuff is about the same diameter as the walls, right?
Yeah.
And it's really sticky stuff, and you're going to pump it 3 times around the earth, or 1 time, or even from here to Los Angeles. You better have a really thick wall. And not this thick, goes down to this thick. Turns out the amount of force you would need to generate in order to push that hard, to push this stuff 3 times around the earth, or another way to say it is the blood vessels cover a football field. That's if you put them side to side, not end to end, so one after the other. The whole blood circulation is that much. That's a hell of a push. And a 1-pound thin-walled organ can't do it. So that's the second head scratcher. The third head scratcher is you have the exit to the left ventricle goes up to the body. And it exits through something called the aortic arch, which is given the name because it's shaped like a McDonald's arch, right? So picture an arch. So the left ventricle, let's just say, pushes the blood through the arch up and then down to the rest of the body, right? The analogy is, let's say you have a garden hose and you put it on the spigot outside your house, and you put it in the same shape as the aortic arch, meaning like this. Now you turn it off, that's diastole. You turn it on, that's systole, that's the pump, because that's what we're talking about, pressure propulsion device. You turn it on, and let's say this tube can bend. What's it going to do?
Bend.
Bend which way?
It seemed like it would bend.
It would straighten,
Yeah.
right? It would go from this to this.
More, yeah.
Right?
Open up.
Now, I used to work in a cardiac cath lab where we would put dye in people's heart and then we'd watch it go through and you would watch it exit. And it was very clear that during the pushing part, so-called, the aortic arch bends in, not straighten, which is totally bizarre because if you're going to push that hard to push sticky fluid with stuff in it that's the same size as the vessel diameter 3 times or 1 time or 2 miles, you need to generate a huge amount of force, and that's going to increase the velocity, which it doesn't, and it's going to straighten the outflow tube, which it doesn't. The outflow tube bends in. And so when you think of all those things together, and Branko has a bunch of other pressure diagrams, so if you're a real sort of science wonk about this, it's a pretty tedious book. Like mine is written like this, so anybody with, who can just think a little bit, I think, can imagine that's not possible. This thing, which is one of the foundational biological truths, it just isn't biologically, mechanically plausible. So when some people say, well, how can you possibly think that it's not, I sort of think, how can you possibly think it is? It just doesn't make any sense. And again, I have a website, The Human Heart, Cosmic Heart, and I have articles, The Heart is Not a Pump, by engineers, and there's a lot of mechanical evidence that this is just not a plausible, or as Ralph, my friend, used to say, it's an inelegant theory.
It's super interesting. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of these, we're taught not to think in school, more memorize. So it seems that we were taught about certain things. And it seems like a very easy analogy with that the heart is pump and it goes around and everything like that. But then how then, can you explain, you talked about like the velocity, if you will, or the delta in which the blood is moving in the capillaries is very minimal to allow nutrient exchange and gas exchange and so forth. How then are things pushed back if the heart is not a pump?
So that's the next good question. So let me rephrase it a little bit. We know now from my description that whatever pumping, or let's change that word to a better word, which is the motive for movement, right? We don't know that it's pumping or not, but we know that there's something that has to begin the movement, and that something better be at the level of the capillaries, because that's where the movement has stopped. So we've at least identified, if there is a pump, it's got to be in your legs and in your liver and everywhere else, which is a much more, it's a better design because you have a whole lot of pumps instead of just one pump. The problem is, if you look in your leg for the pump at the capillaries, there is no pump. So then that gets the question, so how does it start going again? Now, just to say, if you imagine a watershed, so a river goes into wetlands, and then it coalesces back into a river and comes back. The experience or the phenomena of increased volume going to smaller volume diameter will make it go faster, right? If you condense a river into a one channel, by definition, it'll go faster. So we don't have to make it go faster, because it goes from capillaries like the size of a football field to just one central, inferior vena cava that goes into your heart. So that will make it go faster by itself. So, but still, we need to know why the blood starts moving, and Branko, doesn't know that, and so that was, I guess, my contribution. But I didn't make this up by myself. So in order to understand that, you have to understand water, because blood is a biological medium that's based in water. And so this, I get a lot of this from the work of a guy named Gerald Pollack, who wrote a book called The Fourth Phase of Water. We're taught, I don't know which grade, let's say fifth, that matter exists in three phases: solid, liquid, gas. So copper, molten copper, gaseous copper. Water, ice, water, steam. So I used to be an ER doctor, and I used to see people cut open and shot, and we know that the cells are 70% water. So I used to ask, what phase is it in? Well, it's not ice, it's not steam, so it must be water. A cell is membrane-bound bag of water with stuff in it. So the people were shot, and so you would expect to see a geyser of water squirting out of their leg and a puddle on the floor, right? Because that's 70% of them is water, and they just got ripped open. And you know how many times as an ER doctor I saw water dripping out of a person's leg? Or
Zero.
So where's the water? It's the same answer as if you look at Jell-O, right? Everybody knows Jell-O. Which phase is that in? It's not ice, it's not water, because you can poke it and nothing comes out. It's definitely not steam. The problem is there are 4 phases of water, not 3. No matter what anybody says, it's an observable, easy to prove fact, and only water. That's the only one we know that has 4 phases. All the water in the cells is in this gel phase. That's why it doesn't squirt out. So you make gel water, or sometimes called structure water, or Pollack calls it exclusion zone or EZ water, And it has other names too, but structured, exclusion zone, gel, they're all the same. So it means it's in this gel phase. So the way you make it is you take a hydrophilic surface, could be a protein, and you put it in a jar of water. And just by the interaction of the surface and the water, you will form a layer of gel next to the hydrophilic surface. Just happens by itself. That layer, that gel layer, is always negatively charged just through its formation. Mm-hmm. Now, if you imagine a beaker of water and you put a layer of a protein, it forms this gel layer next to it, and then you roll up the protein into a tube, and you'll form, I don't know if people can see, you'll form a gel layer lining the inside of the tube, mm-hmm. right? Yeah. Just happens. And that's negatively charged, and that also means it's separated the charges, and so there's positive charges in the water part. That's probably not a good image, but in the water part inside the tube. Mm-hmm. Those positive ions, protons, they repel each other and start the water flowing in the tube. And that water will flow in the tube, through the tube, out the tube, back through the tube, as long as there's an energy source that will separate the charges. The energy sources are, if you put it in a lead box, it stops flowing. The gel stops forming. If you take it out of the lead box and shine the sunlight on it, it starts flowing again. If you take it out of the lead box and put it on the earth, like earthing, the negative charges or the energy from the earth starts it flowing again. If you put your hands on it, depending on who you are, then it will start flowing again.
Interesting.
So all those things, and probably more, infrared light sources, all the sort of natural energy sources charge up the gels. They create separation of charges, which is the definition of work. That's like a battery. And that work creates flow. Now, an easy way to see that is that's how a plant does it. So here's another thing we learn in school. That water can't go up a tube more than 33 feet before the pressure of the weight of the water is too big, and so that's too heavy and it can't go up anymore, right?
Yeah.
Therefore, there's no trees higher than 33 feet because the water can't, or the water, meaning the sap, can't go higher than 33 feet. The problem is there are trees higher than, there's
much
higher. And even though we're told that can't be, but it is. So it's a question of which do you believe? I believe the fact that it is. So how do we explain that? These tubes, called xylem tubes, are hydrophilic proteins that are lining the tube. They separate the charges. They push the positive ions in the middle. It can't go down because there's the ground. So it starts flowing up, and it'll flow up 500 feet as long as it's not broken.
Wow.
So it's exactly how it works. That, in other words, nature is very conservative. You don't need one method to get sap to flow up a tree. You might as well use the same method to get the blood, the water, or sap in our circulation to flow up the veins. So what is a vein? A vein is a thin-walled tube that's hydrophilic surfaces. It creates this gel layer as long as you're exposed to sunlight, good food, earth energy, human touch, your dog,
things like
all
that.
Those normal life instead of screens and electromagnetic fields and things that degrade your health. So as long as you're in the sun or on the earth, you'll have charged tubes. It will push the positive ions in the middle. They can't go up the arteries because the blood is coming down. So it starts going up the tree, which is your veins, and then it goes, and there's some contribution to your legs squeezing and all those things which we are told, well, it must be because your legs squeeze. And if there's anything I would like to point out to people, so if you say, well, okay, we know the blood stops. How does it go? How does it go to your doctor? He says, well, the legs squeeze, right? That's what we're told. So in other words, if you're paralyzed, the blood stays in your leg and it'll never get out of there, and eventually it'll get more and more, and then you'll fly around the room backwards because your legs are 20 feet wide, right? Well, that doesn't happen. So we're told things that they just don't make any sense. They don't make sense if you think, yeah, but if that's the only way the blood goes up, if you are paralyzed and your muscles don't move, then it shouldn't go up anymore.
Right, it should pool. But you do see kind of pooling
You
and
get a
lymphedema.
little bit.
Right.
Right, you get a little bit. So
Interesting.
there is a contribution. I'm not saying, never said there wasn't, but that's not the main reason. I mean, it works more or less okay, right? It's not perfect, but so there has to be some other reason. So that's the reason. So now we know why the blood moves. There doesn't need to be a pump. There just needs to be this amazingly sophisticated fourth phase dynamics of water. That starts the blood moving. It goes gets narrower and narrower, goes in the inferior vena cava, enters the heart, goes eventually to the left ventricle. What does the heart do? It stops the blood. So what do I mean by that? Well, you have incoming flow like this, comes here, it hits the cavity that is the left ventricle, and there's a valve. So the heart stops the blood, converts it into a vortex. How do I know that? Because Da Vinci proved that 400 or 500 years ago, and Johns Hopkins proved it about 10 years ago with MRIs, and you can see that. And so what happens is the heart holds the blood back. We're not talking about a long time, we're talking about milliseconds, converts the laminar flow into a vortex. And if you can imagine blood coming in, it starts building up, which expands the walls. So there's positive pressure built up on this side and negative pressure on the other side, like a vacuum. So that sucks the tube in, just like we said. How come the tube sucks in? Because there's a vacuum on the far side of the valve. That sucks it in, converts it into a vortex, and that essentially sends the blood on its way. So it does participate in the movement of the blood. I never said it didn't. But my point is, it's not because of a pushing of the walls. The movement comes from from the movement of the blood. The walls expand, which is easy. And then when the gate opens, the blood comes out, now in a vortex, and the walls passively contract, which makes it a lot easier because you don't have to use all that force. And that can go on for 100 years if needed. You can't push that hard for 100 years. That's frankly ridiculous. But you can have a passive expansion. So it isn't that I said the heart doesn't expand and contract. It's the force generation. Now, here's what's interesting about this. Steiner said the heart is like a hydraulic ram. Hydraulic ram is used by farmers and lots of people. It used to be used more. You put it in fast-moving water, and you make a gate, you get an expandable tank, then you build up pressure on this side compared to this side. When the pressure differential is sufficiently different, the gate opens and the the water in that case just goes to where it's needed. And that's how they used to get water from down here to up here. Interestingly, the efficiency of a hydraulic ram is around 70%. In other words, if you measure the amount of incoming water compared to the amount of water that comes out, only 70% comes out each cycle, which immediately brings up the question of what happens to the other 30%? And actually, I don't know what happens. As far as I can tell, nobody knows what happens. Now, a pump always has to work at 100% efficiency. Whatever water comes in, pump, 100% goes out. If you want to take a guess, what is the efficiency of the heart?
I'm going to say 70%.
Exactly 70%.
Interesting. So that's what we call ejection fraction.
That's the ejection fraction. Now, if you're 70%, you're a well-trained athlete. If you're 60%, you're fine. If you're 50%, you're mostly fine, but not quite fine. If you're 20%, you're having trouble. Like, that's not compatible with most life.
And what kind of causes that? I mean, isn't there this notion of left ventricular hypertrophy in individuals? It gets kind of sclerotic and narrow or something? Or?
Well, right. So what causes that? So that's congestive heart failure, when the blood stops moving forward. So now only 50% or 40% or 20% comes out. So, and as he said, if it's not pumping, then the problem is the flow. If the flow isn't sufficient, then the ejection fraction won't be normal. So in a sense, if the flow isn't sufficient, you narrow the blood vessels in order to increase the flow. And that's a problem, because then you get narrower and narrower blood vessels. And then we come along and say, aha, you see your blood vessels are too narrow, that's going to kill you with a heart attack. So we better open the blood vessels. It's like if you have a spitball and you want to shoot it across the room, not that I would suggest that, but if you want to get the biggest spitball you can. Because if you have a really big spitball, you can have a really big straw. If you narrow the straw, you have to have a little spitball. And if you have a little spitball, you can't have a big straw.
Right.
You want a big spitball and a big straw. If you have failure of the circulation, that's the spitball, you have to narrow the straw or you don't get any pressure. That's why the body creates hypertension, to close the blood vessel to increase the flow rate, which means that hypertension and hypertrophy are not the disease, they're the response. They're the compensation mechanism. They're, in a sense, even the therapy. Now, it's true that in this case, the therapy is dangerous, but like I tell a lot of patients, what would you do if you don't have any flow?
Right.
You'd narrow the two.
So is that why we don't see necessarily improved outcomes with certain cardiovascular medications? I don't know the outcome, for example, ACE inhibitors or angiotensin receptor blockers. Do they improve or decrease morbidity in people that use them?
I mean, a little bit, but that's why this cardiac anesthesiologist said we don't really have better outcomes with treating cardiac flow problems, congestive heart failure, than 50 years ago. Because we don't understand where the flow comes from. So for instance, if somebody has poor flow, they'll have poor cardiovascular dynamics. That's where the circulation originates from. So maybe if you put them in the sunlight, put their feet on the earth, gave them a good diet, increase their, all the normal exercise things, all that stuff, you increase flow, and that allows the circulation to relax and function better, because that's the root of the problem. And all these other things like siphoning off fluid with diuretics and decreasing the afterload so that the quote pump is not pumping against so much resistance. They have a very poor efficacy, and they always cause troubles because you're thwarting the body's therapeutic attempt.
And so there's compensatory mechanisms there that maybe there's iatrogenic mechanisms potentially going on.
Exactly.
So
you're treating the wrong thing.
You hit on the grounding quite a bit, and that has to do really fundamentally from a mechanism of action standpoint, addressing this fourth phase of water within the body. Is that,
yes,
if I could surmise a little bit?
That's what it's doing. You're absorbing negative ions. It's a sort of energy source. That Pollock has clearly shown that increases the ability of these. It's literally the same mechanism as making Jello. How do you make Jello? You put water, proteins, and then you put an energy source in. If you just put gelatin proteins in water, nothing happens. So you put heat, and that takes the proteins and unfolds them so that they can interact with the water. And once they interact with the water, then you cool it and it forms this gel. Mm-hmm. So we have these proteins. We have proteins in the blood. We have proteins lining the vessel. When they have an energy source, they unfold, react with the water in the blood, and form Jello, which, not the whole blood, but the lining the blood vessel. That's the same sort of mechanism as how we make Jello. That gel separates the charges, creates the flow. Robust flow allows the heart not to try to compensate by getting bigger or changing the caliber of the blood vessels, and life is good.
How many minutes would you suggest to patients, that you see in your clinic here in San Francisco, in terms of using a grounding mat for sleeping, or just getting out, taking your shoes off, and going out in nature? What would be ideal? Is there a quantifiable number? Obviously, it's different for everyone, but what's the bare minimum exposure to ground or that negative charge you're talking about?
I mean, it depends on everybody's situation. So somebody who's in florid congestive heart failure, and it isn't enough to do that. And I'm not saying that sometimes people don't need to use conventional drugs. They do. But it's not the solution to the problem. If that's the situation, they should spend most of their time either in the sunlight, grounding, walking, or something, because they don't have very much quality of life otherwise. If it's mild, I would say 20 to 30 minutes a day will improve your situation. So it depends. If you can't get out of bed, you're better off putting the bed outside or sitting outside with your feet on the ground.
What exacerbates the challenges? I've heard that traveling, because you're degrounded in an airplane and things like that, cell towers. I mean, what can kind of make things worse?
Well, those two things.
Yeah.
Poor protein consumption. There's certain structural proteins you get from eating mostly structural parts of animals. Collagen itself is a great structure of the water in us, which comes from bone broth. Mm-hmm. So poor diets, but it's probably a lot of it is a consequence of EMF exposure, which destabilizes our ability to make gels. There's other things, aluminum, heavy metals injected into you, glyphosate, all the stuff of modern life.
All the fun stuff that we're all exposed to. That's, as you were jokingly, why you filter your water, because there's Prozac and who knows what else.
All that stuff.
In the water. Going back to the heart, I think it's interesting you talked about how the heart converts the blood, and it's like a vortex. You use that word, and maybe if we can define what that means and then how that's important for people.
So the vortex it's like a tornado or a spiral, or if you look at a sunflower, the seeds are formed in a vortex. Mm-hmm. I'm no physicist, and I can't give you the physics of vortexes, but it's basically the creative energy of life. When life wants to take substance and make it into a living organism, whether it's a snail shell or a DNA or the Milky Way or the spiral on the top of our head or the spiral formation of our bones, that's the creative form of life. Mm. So it all starts in taking, essentially by the time the blood has come back to the heart through the veins, it's in what's called a laminar flow, which means flat flow. And that doesn't have a lot of momentum and doesn't have a lot of creativity, whatever creativity we we mean. It's probably hard to define, but this sort of life force, which, by the way, one of the problems of conventional biology and medicine, starting from Descartes, was we think human beings are just dead substance. We don't have a science of life. We have science of death, which is a problem. Anyways.
You mean that vitality, if you were, that people talk about that, like there's no way, and you go to a traditional doctor, they can diagnose the presence or absence of a disease, but they can't really quantify how vital you are, how much resilience maybe you have. Is that kind of what you're referring to?
Not exactly. I'm referring to something more basic than that, and that's kind of how I think. Here's what I'm referring to, and I like to sometimes ask these as questions. Mm-hmm. So we have a postulate that everything in nature is only made out of stuff, atoms, right? And there's nothing else that exists. That's the fundamental tenet of our modern science. So if I asked you, if you took all the substances that make up a carrot, right? So there's 100,000 atoms of oxygen and 2 million carbons, whatever, right?
Yeah.
And you bought those from a chemical shop and you put those on the table. So now you have a heap of carbon and sulfur and this. Is that a carrot?
No.
Well, but it's supposed to be, because all the substances that make up a carrot are right there. Mm-hmm. So what's missing?
The life force,
But you can even get more just clear. So number one, it doesn't look like a carrot, right? It's like a heap of stuff. So the postulate, or what Steiner would have said, is a living being, like a carrot, is a combination of substance, there is substance, and some life force. Now this life force works through form, right? The thing that's different about the carrot and the heap of stuff is the heap of stuff is the same no matter whether it's the substance that make up a beet or a frog or whatever. There'll be different substances, but they're all a heap. There's no form. So the life force works through form, and it works through water, because there is no life form without water. So what's the definition of life? Substance plus water raised up into a form. There is this, Steiner called it the etheric body. That's a fancy name for, it's a formative force. Now, just because we don't have a word for that exactly, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And, interestingly, all things, substances succumb to entropy and gravity, but not a lilac, right? Mm-hmm. Not a frog, they jump up. Not human beings, we grow up until you're dead, and then you go entropy and gravity. That thing that makes us alive is this life force, this life form that works through water and creates form. I think it's about time we acknowledge that it exists, which most doctors unfortunately absolutely dispute that it even exists. And I'm not talking about some sort of fuzzy concept like, well, we should talk about somebody's vitality. No, we're talking about the thing that distinguishes you from a dead stuff. And we need a science of life. And it starts through the understanding of how water works, which is why I focused the first part of this book and then the next two books on what can we say about this life force? How does it work? What do we know about it? How do you organize it? What helps it? What hurts it? Etc. Because that's where the action is, not the substance. How do you know that? Because do you think the difference between a beet and a carrot is the number of sulfur atoms in one versus the other?
No, there's much more than just the numbers.
Yeah. Everybody knows that, except scientists. They don't know that. They dispute that. But everybody has a sense that there's something ineffable that is called quality also. And the reason we value carrots is not because of the sulfur. There is sulfur, and sulfur may be good for you, but that's not a carrot. And we're stuck in that paradigm, and it's killing us. I mean, the whole thing becomes very interesting, though. For instance, I don't know if this is way off topic, but maybe there isn't a topic here. The most famous, the reason carrots got famous was because of the Gerson diet. Do you know what the Gerson? So the Gerson diet, Max Gerson, was a cancer program and it was mainly a lot of carrot juice. I mean, there was coffee enemas and a bunch of stuff, but he was the originator. He's the reason why people drink carrot juice.
Interesting.
Now, so then you get into the details. So what kind of carrot juice? He said you had to use a Norwalk juicer. That if you didn't use a Norwalk juicer, you might as well not bother with carrot juice because any other juicer won't work. And then, so why? He said, well, the juice from a Norwalk juicer comes out with its charge intact, and the charge is lost if you put it through a Champion juicer. I don't even know if they had Champion juicers, but let's say they did. So what does that mean? Well, a Norwalk juicer, I happen to have one, is a grind and press juicer. So you put the carrots in, they go, and they grind it into a pulp, and then you put it in a bag, and it squishes it, and the juice comes out. And what I think he meant was, so any plant takes water and structures it. There's no water in a plant. I mean, there's water in a plant, but when you carefully extract the fluid from the cells of a carrot, you get it as structured as possible. And it's the structure of the carrot juice, presumably that negative charge or whatever else is related to the structure, the energy that comes with the structuring, that's the therapy. Not just the stuff of the carrot juice, because that comes out in a Champion juicer.
Or any other juicer. Interesting.
Because you put it through this, centrifugal force, you screw up somehow, I don't know the physics of that, you screw up the structure and it doesn't work. So maybe there is some sort of structuring apparatus that helps us. I don't know that. I don't think that's why we eat carrots, but there is some history there.
Okay. So in terms of the dietary sources, right? The collagen, eating, you said bone broth and bone in. So the more kind of unprocessed the meat would be better, and kind of nose to tail in terms of getting that structured water.
Yeah, I don't want to go too far with the reason for eating nose to tail, which is a good idea, and eating grass-fed and pastured is all because it encourages the structuring of water. I think that's probably not really relevant. There's other reasons why that's a good thing.
Right.
The structuring of water comes about naturally through the interaction of the blood vessels and the energy sources that are freely available to us. And so if there's anything to focus on about that, it's the more you subject yourself to abnormal energy sources, which is mostly screen type things or airplanes or that sort of stuff, versus sunlight, earth, human beings, and your dog, the worse you'll be.
Great point. So you mentioned human beings and touching a lot. A lot of people kind of live alone now. They don't have, a lot of people are waiting to get married later in life or not getting married at all, things along those lines. Is that part of this? Not just the connection, but actually the physical, maybe structuring the water in your body? Is that part of it?
Yes. I mean, these are just observable facts that Pollack has done experiments on, that if you take a beaker of water and you want to measure the flow through this hydrophilic tube, if you put your hand on it, the flow increases. And the only reason it's increasing is because you get the gel layer goes from this to this, not exactly that, but it's because it's microscopic, but it increases in its intensity, which separates the charges more, which creates more positive ions, which creates more flow. So I don't say that from some sort of, quote, romantic perspective, that it's just a fact. Humans have an energetic field, one can measure it, and that energetic field, it's not surprising that we're organized biologically to be accentuated by the things that feel good. It's a sort of, I often talk about the cosmic joke theory of life. Like, everybody likes to go out in the sun and go to the beach, right? And walk on the beach. Those are the exact things that charge up your cells. You go to a dermatologist, he says it's not good for you.
Yeah.
In other words, the cosmic joke theory. So flavor is in fats. So you shouldn't eat fats. Go to the cardiologist. Don't eat fats, bad for you. They think it's some sort of a joke, like God or evolution made us to crave certain things, experience joy from certain things, and our culture is sort of based on, but don't do those.
Because we know better.
Because we know, we did a double-blind experiment, never mind that the editor of the New England Journal for 20 years said, 80 to 90% of the studies published in peer-reviewed journals are crap. And I don't say this with any joy, but I say it as the editor of the premier medical journal in the world for 2 decades. Don't believe them.
Well, that's sad and scary. So, you like to look at science and reference it in your books and so forth. How do you decipher that? And do you tend to look at natural processes more and try to retroactively look at the mechanisms involved? And how do you weight the two, right? Because there's a logic part of the brain that probably got you into medicine. Now you're looking at things through a different lens, it seems like.
It reminds me, you asked, I think before we were filming, or whatever you call this,
Yeah.
if I knew this cardiologist. So here's one way to answer this. So this, as long as we're talking, so I hear this debate between a vegan cardiologist and another guy who's a friend of mine who's more of a paleo guy. So they get together on this show and they're going to debate which is the best diet for treating heart disease. And I think it is kind of an answer to your question. So the vegan cardiologist gives a fairly elegant, in the early part of this, quote, debate, description of the history of heart disease in the United States, explaining how in the 1920s and 30s there was almost no heart disease in this country. In fact, there was an interesting story of the guy who invented the EKG machine, which we use to diagnose heart disease, was a Harvard professor, and he offered it to the Harvard faculty, and they said, no, there's no use for this. This was 1918, which was a bad business move on their part, because it's probably made billions of dollars. Anyways, he sold the patent for $10, I think. Anyways, he was very clear, eloquent that there was no heart disease in this. Now, for me, the way I think, no matter what kind of studies have been done, I would have said, how many vegans were there in 1920 in the U.S.? You know what the answer is?
Probably zero.
None by choice.
Yeah.
There may have been a few
couldn't afford
drunks or extremely poor people or people with tuberculosis or something who were not by choice vegans. As far as people who lived in the farm, it was very clear that their best foods were butter, cream, and eggs. That's what most of the people tried to get. And if you look at a cookbook from 1920, it was all about butter, cream, and eggs. Those were the health foods. And people ate other things too, but that's what they thought was good for them. So if you think like apparently I do, which is I trust. So if that's true, and we all agreed, how is it possible that those foods, given that there was no heart disease, are the foods that cause heart disease? How is it possible that if we then go, 80 years later and people eat a lot more plant-based foods than they did then, they didn't really like them then, that keeping going with that is the solution to our heart disease epidemic. What about, well, look, the way we know a time when people didn't get heart disease. They ate this. We can study the Inuit, that's what they ate. We can study the Native Americans, that's what they ate. They ate buffalo or fish or whatever else, insects. All these people, no heart disease, they all ate the same diet, lots of animal food with full fat. How is it possible that those foods cause heart disease? Like, that should have been the end of the debate. Mm-hmm. Even the interesting thing, they didn't get into this, but we're told that we should all adopt plant-based diets to save the world from climate change or desoilization or loss of topsoil. But if you just think about it, the Europeans who arrived on the Great Plains, they'd find 100 million buffalo and topsoil 12 feet deep. Mm. And they ate basically people living off harvesting the buffalo. And then they dig up the soil and plant wheat and other grains. 50 years later, the topsoil blows away to the Gulf of Mexico and they have the Dust Bowl. Now, 100 years later, the place is dead. Now, the solution to that ecological catastrophe is not bring back the 100 million buffalo, it's plant more soybeans. But we did that for even organic for the first 50 years before the Dust Bowl. They didn't have pesticides. They planted organic wheat and corn. Mm-hmm. That's what happened. Why is... Anyways, so if somebody had a study and said, eating butter caused heart disease, I wouldn't believe it.
Well, it's interesting about that. And since you're a deep thinker, I didn't think we'd actually start talking about these different conversations. But as influencers, they start talking about something, right? You mentioned a vegan cardiologist. So they get some notoriety. They're known for that. And so they're constantly searching for ways to confirm their bias and support and kind of dig their heels into the ground and keep talking about that. So do you think it's a psychological phenomenon where once someone makes up their mind about this, they get some notoriety, some attention, they're constantly searching for more information to confirm that? Or
it's like Will Rogers, I think, or it may have been Mark Twain, I get them confused, said, never try to convince somebody of something that's against his making his living. So, I don't know why they've got this far with that. They see certain things. I can imagine that if you take somebody who eats standard American crap and you put them on temporary, I've written books. It's not that I'm against vegetables. I have a whole company devoted to helping people get vegetables. I have an acre vegetable garden that I tend. Nice. So I like vegetables. I know a lot about vegetables. I even know, I think, more about how to eat vegetables than probably 99% of the vegans, which that may now come back to haunt me, but I actually think I do, because the traditional way to eat vegetables was wild and perennial vegetables, not broccoli, kale, and iceberg lettuce. Anyways.
So that's very interesting. I grow a fair amount. I have like 600 square feet in our backyard dedicated to growing vegetables and things like that. I think I'm not a fan of kale after seeing, it's very robust and resilient. Yeah. I see why it's popular, but some of the wild vegetables like arugula and different, what are some like maybe 5 or 6 that people can recognize that they should focus on?
I grow tree collards and perennial vegetables. There's one called Genera procumbens, there's one called ashitaba. We have probably 20 different perennial vegetables in our garden right now, roquette. I grow whatever perennial and wild vegetables concentrate nutrients. Essentially, modern agriculture has been taking diverse, nutrient-dense land and turning it into sugar. Like that's, if you look at the difference between the plains in 1850 versus 1980, every nutrient that you could harvest from an acre of buffalo and rabbit and quail and wild greens and all that. So we've essentially switched nutrients for sugar, and then we're all diabetic. So that's not a great trade.
Yeah. What books would you recommend for people if they want to learn more about kind of eating some of these perennial vegetables? A lot of people reference Eating on the Wild Side. Are you familiar with that book?
Yeah. I mean, the best book on food ever written is Nourishing Traditions. So
Yeah.
Everybody should start with that, and then they don't need any other books.
Timeless classic. Yeah, I think we have it in our kitchen. It's dirty from all the soups and stews and everything along those lines. Maybe we can finish up on the heart and kind of the cosmic aspect, and maybe the fact that sometimes people say we have a heartache, or if something seemed incongruous with our values, it kind of hurts our heart. We didn't really address that, and I think that's important for people to understand.
I mean, one of the most interesting phenomena is people who get a heart transplant often, not always, but sometimes, I'll say it's a better word, take on the personality of the person whose heart they got. Mm-hmm. There's some very interesting cases about this, even some interesting cases of people who are like, racist types who got the heart of a black person, and next thing you know, their whole movement pattern is more fluid, and they start liking music, and they start being friendlier, more flowing sort of people. So there's some interesting evidence that your heart is your personality. It's the thing that if you meet somebody now and then you meet the same person in 30 years, they're still the same person. And that's somewhat tied up, even though every cell, every physical atom in their body is probably different, but they're clearly the same person. And that probably has something to do with the form and shape and being of the heart. At least because we know that, if you transplant and get a new heart, you get a new personality. Not that you're a different person, but you feel like a different person. So, I mean, it's the answer to that's partly when people say there is nothing but substance, we are just physical beings. And so then they say, I love you with all my heart. Oh, I mean, there's no love in your heart. If you dissect somebody's heart, I can guarantee you will not find anything called love. So it's one of those things, like you said earlier, we all know it's not true, but we pretend and act like it is. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't study physical stuff, because it's interesting and that's what our world is mostly based on. But it's not where the action is, either with medicine or with love, for that matter, because it's not a physical thing. And it's interesting, one of the definitions of science is all about the things that you can measure and quantify. That's what it says in Wikipedia. I've looked it up. So when people say to me, doctors, etc., so I only believe in substance. I say, do you love your wife? Yes. How much? Like 10? Yeah. 64 and a half out of 18? Mm-hmm. Well, you said there's nothing exists but things you can quantify. So therefore it must be, if you quote, believe you love somebody, you must have a number for it. Otherwise it's not true. You just told me it's not true. And so it's nonsense, obviously nonsense, but we believe it. And so we create this artificial reality, which isn't actually how the world is organized. And that's a problem. And then you ruin the world and then you die. So that's where we're headed with this.
Well, I think people are quantifying their heart, if you will, through heart rate variability, at least, are starting to get an idea. that maybe they can improve resilience and compassion, things like that, via this external device, with the Heart Math Institute and things like that.
Yeah.
Are you in favor of that, or how do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, you can get feedback on how your heart is functioning, and whether it's, like with heart rate variability, you're not supposed to be a metronome, or if you want to have music, you can't have the drummer be a metronome because it sounds mechanical, and you can't have the drummer be somebody who can't hold a rhythm. That's like AFib. You have to have somebody who has flexible rhythmical skills. That's your heart. And if it's inflexible, it's a metronome, and that doesn't work. And if it can't hold a rhythm, the other organs can't find their way, and then it's like a orchestral piece where the oboe's playing one piece and the violin's playing another piece, and a different rhythm. The heart is the conductor of that. And so I'm not saying one can't measure that, but what I'm saying is the origin of the heart rate variability is not from some substance in the heart. It's from the function of the heart.
Interesting. Why is there such a high prevalence of heart disease more in like Western men? Like, executives, things like that, attorneys, and you talk about in the book, like Native Americans, the prevalence of heart disease.
Because of the way we live. Because they never get outside. They think about ridiculous things all day, like money. And it's no wonder they can't connect with anything real. And if you can't connect with real and love and the earth and plants and animals and, grass-fed food, you're going to get sick. It's not rocket science.
Right. In terms of financial wealth, do you think it's health and financial wealth, are they mutually exclusive?
Well, people who have more money tend to be able to, in this country, buy more access to things that keep them healthy. However, there's an argument that the worst thing that can happen to somebody is to have too much money, because it makes them loopy and do nasty things. And if you don't believe me, just read some history or talk to Mark Zuckerberg.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned you manage an acre farm, right?
Garden.
You're treating patients, you're writing books, right? Like the garden, the more time you allocate to your garden, the more time away from building your business, your practice, things like that, right? Like I found that personally. We have pigs and chickens and turkeys and everything like that. And I find I love it because it gets me outside in the morning. I'm barefoot, but I'm also like, oh man, this is so much time. But then I think, well, but it's improving our family's quality of life. So I grapple with this, and I think other people do. They say, I don't have time to raise chickens. I just order my eggs off Amazon, right? So how would you approach that?
Well, I'm getting to be an old guy, so I hopefully am on the downside of having to work. And I often say work is overrated. But obviously we live in a situation where we need money in order to survive. So it's not like I'm telling people don't survive, don't do what you need to do to, quote, make a living. But I did spend some time in the book talking about the origin of money and how messed up that is. I don't think we should go into that right now.
Yeah.
But it's basically a kind of a criminal enterprise. So we have a long way to go to create a just society where people live fun, happy, creative lives. Most of us are somewhere in the slave labor kind of wage labor, slave labor, kind of milieu, and that's not so good.
When you retire, will you stay in California?
Well, I don't know. Depends.
Yeah. I mean, I was in the sauna yesterday at the gym in San Rafael, and there was a bunch of folks from Guatemala and so forth. And I said, if money didn't matter, would you still live in California? And they said, no, I'd go home.
A lot of people probably wouldn't know.
Yeah. But it's hard to make a living at home because they said they make $4 a day
right.
versus $17 an hour here, right? So
Right.
It's that trade-off, and I think a lot of people are grappling with that. But that being said, if someone is stuck doing the 9 to 5, stressed out, it's incongruent with their values and their beliefs, will that manifest in poor cardiovascular health?
Well, not always, but certainly a lot of times. And if I would only say if you're in a situation where what you're doing with, a third of your life basically every day sucks, you might want to rethink it, unless you just think that's a okay way to live your life. I mean, I wouldn't.
Do you think
Whether
when
you get heart disease or not, what's the point?
people are scared,
Right.
fearful?
Well, then, at some point, what are we going to do about the fact that a couple 100 million of us are scared, insecure, and worried about what's going to happen next? Like, maybe we should talk about this.
Yeah, I think Paulo Coelho, is it Paul Coelho? Do you read his books? The Pilgrimage, and then he's got The Alchemist.
No, don't know.
He's got a great, if anyone is curious and is struggling with this conundrum about fear and all that, he's got a great.
Right, it's a big deal.
It's a big deal. Well, we've navigated a range of different topics. I'm very grateful for this conversation. We have 3 final questions we ask every guest on the show. We know that morning routines, successful people, authors, physicians like yourself, have a set of, kind of rituals they do in the morning, things that kind of set up their day for success, if you will. Is there anything that you do in the first couple hours every day that you think helps with your creativity and your productivity, things along those lines?
Not so much. I tend to, I do a lot of so-called intermittent fasting. So I stop eating at 6, usually the night before. Then I don't eat anything until around noonish the next day. And my best days are the days that I just get up and go to the garden. And I spend the next 3 hours. I sometimes use the word working in the garden, but it's not working. I have a new word for it called plorking, which is a combination of play and work. And so that's what I do, and that's what I like to do. But I don't have any set routine that somebody else should try.
Are you barefoot?
Not so much, because there's too many prickers.
Oh yeah, around here there is.
Or mulchy things. Anyways, it's a good idea, but I get my hands in the soil.
That's right. Yeah. Do you compost
Yes.
as well? Yeah. It's funny. A lot of people don't compost. They just throw stuff in the trash. It's kind of a shame.
It's not.
Yeah. Do you have animals too, or just?
No. Well, there is it's not my land, but the homestead has chickens, but they're not my chickens.
If there was one herb, nutrient, botanical that you're stranded on a desert island, vitamin D, omega-3 is covered, right? If you were just to bring like one plant with you, one supplement, one herb, what would it be?
It'd probably be eggs, I think. I mean, you could probably live on eggs probably better than anything else.
Yeah, I love eggs, but we shouldn't eat them, right? They're high in cholesterol.
Right.
Yeah. I didn't want to ask you about oxidized cholesterol. I don't know if we'll have time.
No.
Yeah, no. Read the book, guys. But if you were to bump shoulders with a politician, and maybe this has happened to you, a senator, governor, a parliament member of another country, in an elevator, and they were going to meet with their constituency and things like that. What's like the most important message on a societal level that folks can take away that maybe we can influence some policy around to improve health?
I don't have much faith or belief that politics or the government has much to offer us. But I would just point out that any form of coercion is the opposite of freedom. Anytime you coerce somebody to do anything, which includes going to school, paying taxes, getting vaccinated, joining the military, anything, if you're going to do that, you might as well say, we decided we're not interested in freedom. The two are fundamentally incompatible. I don't see any healthy society using force-based coercion to make their citizens do anything and call that a free society.
When you hit on vaccines, the whole herd immunity thing would be a red flag.
That's too long.
That's in your new book. You talk about that as well, which I think, you know, vaccines, it's so polarizing, as you've probably found, yeah?
It is very polarizing, but it's too late in this conversation.
No, why do you think it's polarizing? Why are people so defensive about it? If you're against...
Because they're told to be defensive about it. They're told to be scared, and scared people do crazy things.
So it's the really ultra compliant people. I found that
it's just fear-based. It's the epitome of fear-based information.
Yeah. So if people are listening right now in iTunes, walking the dog, etc., or they're watching this still on YouTube, which we're grateful that you guys are listening or watching, and they wanted to connect with you, follow your work, where should they do that?
I have a bunch of websites, but I would go to humanheartcosmicheart.com and Dr. Cowan's Garden, DrCowans garden.com. Those are my two main websites.
Love that. And are you on social as well? Do you do Instagram or Facebook or anything along those lines?
I think the businesses might.
Yeah.
But I have nothing to do with any of those.
Because you just don't want to be bothered by the screens?
I don't want to. I'm not a supporter of that or the emotional, psychological space that those get you in, or the companies that run them.
Mm-hmm. And how much bandwidth they eat up if you're active on them?
I don't know. I don't do it, so I don't know much about it.
Yeah, Dr. Tom, really appreciate you coming on the show. Thanks so much. Appreciate your time. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys. Please hit that like button. I'll be following the comments and share this with a friend or family member that can benefit. Definitely go out and check the books, The Human Cosmic Heart and Vaccines, Immunity, and the Changing Nature of Childhood Illnesses. We'll catch you on the next video.